James Lesher, and this is our exhibit. This is an exhibit we did with Catherine and John Smith, the owners of the former barn and the new barn in which we're standing that took its place, in which we have the exhibit. And it was also done in partnership with Christopher McNeil, architect and historian, who laid out the exhibit and did some really great, satisfying history on each one of the barns. So here are the four barns, just as an introduction, and probably in chronological order: the log and crib barn here, the stone and frame barn here, the double-decker enormous barn right here, and the Smith's barn, the former Smith's barn right here. As you can see here from the map, they're pretty close to each other within Penns Valley, probably just 2 zip codes here, 1 zip code here and another here.
My name's Chris McNeil. I'm an architect and a historian and a longtime interest in barns in central Pennsylvania. Catherine invited me to work with James to help put together this exhibit, to think of themes that we would use to explore the 4 very different barns that he's looked at. And we came up with 2 themes. The first was an exploration of the Pennsylvania bank barn type. While the 4 barns are very different, they are all examples of a traditional barn type. We wanted to explore the range of variation within of Pennsylvania bank barns. And the second idea was the stories of farms and the families that develop them. And by looking at documentary sources, that would be tax records and census material and deeds, information we can find that's factual and helps us to understand the history of a farm, that would explain, put into context the barn, so we can understand some of the differences in why barns were built the size they were, why they were constructed. Understanding that, like most of the barns in Penns Valley, these 4 were not the first barns on the farm. They came on top of several generations of family development and accumulation of the resources to build the magnificent structures that James looks at.
This is the first barn in the exhibit, the way Christopher designed this exhibit. It's called the Moyer Crater Shawver Barn. This is the frame and crib barn. It is one sited behind the Penns Valley High School. They had purchased it and then flipped it. So in the interim, Catherine Smith was able to get me in there and study this. And I really only studied the original log and crib part here. I did not really care too much about the straw shed addition. Here you see the forebay from that barn. Here in this picture you can see the crib on one side and the inside of the barn. It's a log and crib, it's a frame and crib barn, so it's a combination of timber framing with the cribs on each side for the hay storage. Here we're looking out the north doors, and you can see in this photo there is still some existing ornamental hardware on the doors. These are images of the second barn in the exhibit. It's called the Krotzer Holland Barn. It's right across the road from where I live, so I was given access over many years every time the owner went away, and I took photos and studied it over the years. You can see it's a stone and frame barn. Here you see an image of one of the corners of the building it's really ornamental. It's comprised of limestone quoins and then the sandstone walls. And these are shots of the windows here in the basement, and then this is the east wall that shows the larger windows as opposed to the west wall that has the narrower slits. And here's an image of the queen post framing And there's a lot of inscriptions, inscribed names on the doorways in the lower part of the barn that are very helpful for building the history of this barn, which Chris did a great job.
The Pennsylvania Bank Barn is a barn type. It was an idea about how to construct barns that came with German immigrants from Central Europe. It originated in the Swiss Alps. It was a barn type developed by people who combined dairy farming with herds of cattle and grain production. It was one of several barn types that came to the United States or came to America from Europe. And it was the one that predominated in central Pennsylvania. The main components of this barn type are that it's on two levels. It's often built into a hillside or has a ramp on the backside so that the upper level, which was used for storage of crops and threshing, can be accessed by loaded farm wagons. The lower level is the stable for horses and cattle, and the most important feature of this type is that the upper level has a forebay, which is a projection over the stable level that protects the stable doors. The Pennsylvania Bank Barn idea is also a modular concept. It's built as a series of bays. The upper level usually has a open wagon floor, a threshing floor in the middle, maybe several. And then on either end are hay mouths, spaces for the storage of cut hay. And over the wagon floors are oberdens, which were used for drying sheaves of wheat and oats. And they would be threshed with flails on the threshing floor, the open floor of the barn. Over time, in the 19th century, horsepower mechanization began to affect the way that farm work was performed. But the basic organization of the bank barn still continued to work. And these barns were built in this area from around 1800 into the 1940s.
The third barn in this laid out exhibit is the Gensel Hodge Stoltzfus barn. And this is one that we were lucky enough to get into because the barn, in a very unique way, is also part of the easement on this farm's property. So this was really a chance of a lifetime because it's a double-decker barn. And you can see here the ramps, the earthen ramps that go up to it tell you that it's a double-decker barn. This is the gable end here. And there's a few images of framing in here. This particular image shows you just how extensive the double-decker framing is. And since there are 7 bents in this whole barn, there's an extreme amount of framing in this barn. In addition to the framing, there are dozens of ladders. And these images show you the historic windows on the barn and some grill work here. The fourth and last barn in this exhibit, not because it's the least, but it's the barn that started this whole project, is the Ream Erdel Smith barn, Catherine Smith's original barn that stood on this property and where we are standing right now that was replaced by this new barn we're in which the exhibit is. Here you see the day of, if not hours before or minutes before it was being taken down. They did for years and years take care of the barn, do some Band-Aid framing and re-roofing, but at some point it was just too much. And in order to leave a more functional building for conservation purposes in the future, they built this barn that we're in right now. So this is minutes before the dismantlers hit it with the chainsaws and knocked it over. You can see with the waviness here how it was going. Catherine In the weeks leading up to this dismantling, repeatedly pressured me to measure this barn, and that's really, like I was saying, where this all started. And from there, it inspired these other barns and more to be measured and drawn up. This is the forebay of that original barn. This is a really interesting photograph that shows you the complexity of the roof rafter hitting an upper plate, and a picture of the split forebay doors that were down below, on which we decided to hang these photographs.
James Lesher and Chris McNeil in this showing of 4 barns, all within 2 miles of the barn we're standing in, and how different they are and how extraordinary each one of them is, makes the sort of point that each barn is different. They might look alike as you drive down the road, but they are not. And the other point I would like to make is that each barn tells many stories about itself, about, first of all, the trees that were growing, that it's made from. And for this barn, which was probably the 3rd barn on this site, we're told, there had been earlier ones, James Lesher did a tree ring count on one of the fresh cuts in a beam that came down from it, and got as far as, I think, around 180 rings before we had to stop. That means the trees that this barn was made from were growing in the late 1600s. That's probably true of most of these old barns around Penns Valley. So that's one of the stories, is the trees, the forests, and the barns that emerged from them. The other is the people who built it. That's certainly a story, because with multiple barns on each site, as many families over 200 years have lived on this site. Very interesting, I'm sure, stories of who built each barn. And then there's the joinery, the techniques that each builder both borrowed and adapted in working. So the whole history of the building techniques, story of the building techniques. And then we could continue with that. I mean, the wildlife that lived in this barn, along with all the farm animals. When this barn was pulled down in the few minutes of, just really heartbreaking collapse of that barn, James and I were watching the dust settle, and this lone bat came circling out of the old barn. Okay, and they're all back in the new barn, so we don't have to feel too bad. But this is the barn, as James says, that started our real strong desire to know what it was, to know its story. James had, in years past, in the wintertime, stepped in and done some watercolor sketches of how it looked. That's what you'd see when you come in the lane or drive down the road, perhaps. And this is what's under it, and this is what's in it. And those are all parts of that barn's story, and its story is different from all the other barns. So maybe later we can look at some of the ironwork, which is another craft that went into all these barns.
As I said before, it was Catherine and John Smith's barn that, on its way to being dismantled, that started this whole project. And in particular, it was, this is a mock-up, a recreation of a joint I found on the ground that was isolated from the rest of the barn by the dismantlers and their chainsaws. It was just hacked out of their way so they could just use the lengths of the beams. And I saw this thing lying on the ground in pieces and apart, and I was captivated. I knew something happened at that moment in time where I felt like I had to study this. It was very complicated, and I decided to recreate it and make a mock-up here, and I also drew it up right here. And from there, I realized I had to look at these other barns and find out what I'm calling the tying joints look like, and see if there were similarities, if there were differences, and I've found all kinds of tying joints, and I'm eager to find more. So what this is, this mock-up, this funny-looking sculpture here, is the post coming up with the longitudinal plate meeting it, and then the tying end plate coming over top, and additionally a roof rafter that's set in place right at that corner. So that's what happened up at the corner of the original barn. And I had to, I got down on the ground, I measured each cut, and these are two different views of a axonometric type drawing to really figure that out and to try to show that to others. This is one from above, and this is one if you were looking up. And it's very complicated, as you can see, particularly by the tying plate right here, and it must have been part of a tradition that builders develop over time. The first barn in this exhibit of the 4 barns that we studied is the Moyer Crater Shawver barn here. It is the log and timber frame combination barn that you see right here of these 4. There's a slightly larger picture showing the cribs and the center timber frame. So I drew up a bunch of different views to demonstrate that. Here you see an elevation of it that shows it in a different way, the cribs on each side and the center frame. And then here you see the center bent in section and an example of an elevation at the gable end of the log crib. In all the barns that I studied and drew and looked at, I always tried to find the tying joint and draw that up, and I find in each case they're different and unique and exciting. And here it is. It's actually got an action sequence. It's different than all the rest. The second barn in the exhibit is the Kratzer Holland barn, which is right across the road from where I live. And it is really an interesting barn, I thought, because of the combination of it being a masonry barn, stone masonry, with a timber frame and that has 3 bents. It seemed like a real interesting feat for the masons to hit all of these elevation points that they had to hit. There are pockets in the walls for the floor joists. There's an elevation they had to hit here for the forebay sill. Again and again, the girders had a spot, an elevation here. There are pockets in the gable end walls for the girders, for the queen post purlins. Here are the rests for the tying rafters that go across. So I often wondered who was in charge in this building, the masons or the timber framers. It was one I ruminated about. Just a really fascinating barn. And all the energy and labor and expense that it would have taken to do all that stonework. And it's beautiful stonework, as evidenced by the images. What I always try to do in these barns, like I said before, is find the complicated tying joints and measure them and draw them up. And here I looked at a tying joint that was about right here in the barn. So it was where a post came up and the longitudinal plate came across, and as well as in the 90 degrees the other direction, the tying beam that came across. So here's the tying beam coming across, here's the longitudinal plate, but it meets in the center. It's a half lap over top of this post, and it's just a beautiful puzzle of joinery. The third barn in the exhibit is the Gensel Hodge Stoltzfus barn. And it was the opportunity of a lifetime to get into this barn, thanks to Catherine Smith. Here you see it compared to the other 3 barns. It's much larger. It has 7 whole bents. And it deserves a exhibit all by itself someday to really dig even deeper into it. But that's what this was about, to try to, I can't tell you how many people wanted to see this barn themselves, so the point of this one of the points of this exhibit is to give that opportunity for folks in a slightly abstract way. So you see here just how enormous this barn is, the 7 vents and the 20-some ladders, countless long tying plates. And here you see a principal rafter system on it as well. It was such an enormous barn. It had a hierarchy of rafters, larger ones, 7 larger ones, and then the secondary ones in between. I also looked at, it has this ramp system to go up to the 2nd floor, which was really fascinating. And then this barn was the first one I started looking at in terms of the storage volumes. I did not calculate them yet, but it would be interesting to compare that to the volumes in the other barns. And like I said, there are 7 bents across this barn, and we drew each one up, and each bent is different. We did elevations as well. It's just an astounding barn, and it could really use its own exhibit. The 4th barn in the exhibit, the last one in the way we laid it out, but not, of course, the least, was the Ream Erdahl Smith barn, the barn that formerly stood in place of the new one we're in now, owned by John and Catherine Smith. You can see here, it was probably, Chris thinks it was the latest barn of these 4 barns, the last one. But you can see in relative size, these 3 are all compare pretty well in contrast to the much larger double-decker barn. It's composed of the 5 bents, and it has the wagon bay on the end, which Chris felt really dated it, probably after the Civil War, and shows why maybe it was a later barn, or else it was altered to receive that tractor bay on the end. This was probably the most important barn in the exhibit because this is the barn that started this all 4 years ago. When it was being taken down, or minutes after it was taken down, there was a chainsawed joint of 3 or 4 timbers coming together lying on the ground, and I saw that on the ground, and I thought I'd just seen something entirely new for the first time in my life, and I had to take it all apart and draw it up, and it's what's inspired in part this whole exhibit, and to look at other barns in the future. It was a joint that I found on this corner of the barn, and that's what inspired me to do the mock-up and look at more barns. There's a fun collection of artifacts that Catherine pulled together here that we'll talk about. And I'll just move through them here. Here's a section of one of the ladders and some of the oak rungs. See, they're chamfered for the part that your hand holds onto, and they're squared where they're mortised into the uprights. These, I believe, are a few pieces of the old threshing floor, and somebody actually planed this to see the grain, what it looks like. Here's a bird's mouth rafter joint. It's so typical of these old barns. And there was no plate that ran across the top to put the joists on. They just came together like that. There's a tenon and slightly offset so that when they hit it in, it drew them together. And then on the lower end of the rafter, this is the remains of the decorative finish on that 18 inches or so that hung out over the end, the eave. This is a nice example of, it shows you what, and oftentimes they did in the forebays of these barns. There was a little bit of detail and paying attention to a little bit of dressing up in the forebays in so many of these barns. This is the floor joist down below that is visible, and oftentimes they would chamfer or take off the corner of these joists. This is not all that beautiful, but you can see what came upon the old barn. This is powder post beetle, pretty badly damaged. It was probably the main cause of the barn coming down. Rafters were often done in sets or pairs as they came down and rested over the purlin. This is the one that met, or maybe it was like this. And they were housed a little bit over it, and you can see the hole where the rare, very large spike was set to set that into the purlin. When you have a barn dismantled, it's a really great opportunity to count rings, examine rings, and just be in awe of it all. This is one of the main structural beams from the barn. This is pine, and this is maybe a secondary piece. This is oak. What's really fascinating is to see the number and then the consistent areas of growth. This is kind of cool, the center part where the rings seem to be more pronounced. But what's the most fascinating part of this is to just probably just go ahead and say that here we're somewhere around the 1600s, and then moving outwards we're getting closer to the 1800s when, the 1850s when this tree was felled. And where are we at now, 2023, so it's kind of amazing to feel and look at something that's from the 1600s right there. Also, we have another example with these pins that go in these mortises and tenons here. There was a certain hierarchy. This was a more major joint in the barn, so it had the larger set and the double set of pins, whereas this was from some of the more minor joints. And it's also fun to see all the scribe lines here and how they located the position where they wanted to auger out the holes.
One of the stories that all these old barns have is the ironwork that was used for hooks, hangers, and this item called a pintle. Those half doors swung open and shut on this pintle, and this is forged, and when it's hot, cuts are made into the long end so that when it's inserted into the wood, it does not come out easily. So that's how barns stand and their doors swing for hundreds of years. And getting these out took some special sawing and cutting and hacking to get to them. Another thing that I learned in the parts and pieces of this barn, including the ironwork, is, we know that nails were handmade and some of them forged. But at a later point, when our barn, probably in the 1850s, was being built, you could buy wire cut nails, as they call. This is a strip of wire, it's got squares, got sides on it. And then when you pounded the nail to put it in place, some of the people who were doing the nailing loved to make patterns in how they pounded the head of the nail. And the famous pattern is called a rose head. This is a nail with its point that may be forged, actually. That's not square. It may be a forged nail. But the pattern of putting it in the wood was on 4 hits to make a flattened 4 sides, and you get a rose. So that's a rose head nail, I think. And this was one of the closings that held the doors shut. Or rather, that's not true. This is how you open the door when you wanted to go in. So there's a little turn handle to do it. And that's going to get a lot of wear. So long nail to hold it in place. Sometimes, just to be sure, they did what's called clinching. The nail was somehow, I can't figure out how, but once it was in the wood, you could go in and bend it. So It really won't come out, no matter how many times that door is opened. Now, I'm certainly not, well, I'll just tell you what I learned about the ironwork part of barns. The ironwork may be older than the wood, because ironwork was so expensive. It was always carefully preserved and then reused when a barn was taken down and rebuilt. And a blacksmith friend came over and looked at some of these things that we'd taken from our old barn, and to give me the example of the different ages of the pieces of iron that he was looking at, probably, and which ones were forged and which ones were cut. He said he had looked at a notebook once, an account book kept by a blacksmith, and he didn't give me the exact date, but early days, listing what it cost to make the materials that he made for people to build with. And the item he could remember was for 5 nails, don't know what nails, but here's a nail example. For 5 nails, the trade was 2 days plowing. So that just gives you an example. You would not throw that nail away when your barn came down and was being rebuilt. You would reuse it. So another story in barns is their ironwork. The ironwork was functional, as I say, hooks, door turners, hangers of various kinds, because the buildings, timber frame buildings, weren't built with nails. They were built with pegs. But this is the functional, door hook kind of thing. So had to have ironwork. And there's so many questions about who did what. The number of crafts that go into the building of a barn. And you wonder, were they semi-professionals that wandered about and offered their skills on contract? Or did the owners, the farmers themselves have skills? Did someone in the family have all the skills that were needed? Big questions. We don't know those answers, but this barn, as I suspected, when we began to follow up on James's intent learning about how this barn got built, meant that a whole lot of questions still need to be answered.
So as part of our exhibit to show the 4 barns that we studied and measured and drew up, we decided to include this small timber frame structure right here. More than anything, it was here, and there was no way we could move it out of the way. So, but it's really important in the whole timeline and theme of this exhibit. What it is it's a king post design, 12 by 12 timber frame, and it's constructed out of, and it is a memorial to the barn that previously stood in place of the one we have here now. We decided to ask the dismantlers, as they were taking down the Smith's original barn, we begged them, please can we have a small pile of beams to build something? We thought we had this great idea to memorialize the old barn. Glad we did it, and we just pulled just enough material where we were able to create this. John wanted to try this king post design, and we had just enough and just the right dimensions. We have all kinds of ideas for it, but here it sits, and it made a nice piece to go along with the exhibit.